Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The Iranian president's recent visit to Iraq has been hailed as historic for both sides. At a time of tough U.S. sanctions, Iran needs Iraq as a gateway, especially for banking and other transactions. Iraq needs Iran too. Iran supplies up to 45%, according to some estimates, of Iraq's daily electricity and gas needs. The elephant in the room is the U.S., which wants Iraq to distance itself from its neighbor, yet cannot provide reliable alternatives. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Professor Farhang Jahanpour, who is a professor at the University of Oxford. He is joining us live now from London. And we're also joined now by Professor Luciano Zaccara, who is a political analyst and is also research assistant professor at Qatar University. He's joining us from Kuwait. Luciano and Farhang, thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out. Farhang, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of President Rouhani's trip to Iraq? He was certainly received in a much more welcoming fashion than, for example, his predecessor, Ahmadinejad, was.
Yes, good morning to you and all your viewers and listeners. As you pointed out, I think it is a historic visit in many respects. I'm a historian by profession, and I think in order to understand the current situation, especially in view of the very heavy pressure by the current U.S. administration on both Iran and Iraq not to have close relations, it's really important to go back a bit and look at history before coming to the current situation and see why this is historic.
Okay.
The two countries go back to the dawn of history. In fact, the Sumerian civilization, which with the Egyptian and the Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest civilizations of the world, developed in what is now southern Iran and Iraq, in the Mesopotamian area and Iranian Khuzestan, dating back to about 4000 BC. They had amazing achievements. For example, they invented writing. We have their first writings around 3500 BC. They developed the first code of law in history. They developed music, they developed astronomy, mathematics. So the history of relations between these two countries goes back a very long way. Even in the more recent times, during the Sasanian times, Iran's capital was in fact in Tisiphone, which is not very far from current Baghdad. And Baghdad itself is a Persian word. Bagh means God in the Zoroastrian. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough.
No problem.
So Baghdad means the city of God. Therefore, it is impossible to separate these two countries from each other.
Okay, so Luciano, put into context for us the historical relations between these two countries. But of course, coming now to contemporary times, as he said, there is well a lot of pressure on the Iraqi government to step away from Iran. Is that going to work?
To say hello to Professor Jahanpour. It's a pleasure to meet him, even though it's virtually. I would love to meet him personally. Of course, I don't think it's going to work, the pressure, because as was mentioned in the introduction, both countries need each other. I mean, the United States cannot provide Iraq what Iran is providing, and basically all goods that they are coming from Iran. I mean, the $12 billion a year of exchange cannot be replaced by the United States. So the United States cannot ask Iraq to avoid negotiating with Iran, because the United States or any other country is providing what Iraq needs. And Iran is already there. Since 2003 until now, they have been developing trade and other kind of relations with the new Iraqi government. So it's basically very difficult to stop this to happen. And of course, we shouldn't forget the exchange of people from crossing the border from one place to the other due to the pilgrimages in Najaf and Karbala, and also in Mashhad and Qom. And this is also unstoppable. And at the end, it's not only bilateral trade between the capital, between Baghdad and Tehran, is the regional commerce between mainly Kurdish provinces from one place or the other, or even in the south, is very important. So it's very difficult to stop that. And also it's very difficult for Iran to avoid negotiating with Iraq, because as it was mentioned, this is one of the exits that Iran has nowadays, having in mind the sanctions that they are suffering.
Okay, Farhang, it wasn't always very, very rosy relations between these two countries, was it? Even after the fall of Saddam Hussein. I remember, and we can go back to the time, for example, when Ahmadinejad visited Iraq, he wasn't received in a very welcoming fashion by many facets of Iraqi society. What do you think has changed this time around? Is it the fight against ISIS, which Iran supported Iraq in? Is that what has supported this more positive atmosphere?
I think under President Ahmadinejad, Iraq was very much still under U.S. occupation, and so had to be very careful about their reaction. He was very warmly received. Again, like President Rouhani, he openly went to all the cities and received huge welcome. But he was not received by the Supreme Ayatollah Sistani, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, probably because he had some differences of views with Ahmadinejad and also because he was not cleric. But of course, as has been mentioned in many Iraqi and Iranian newspapers, President Rouhani went public with huge crowds, and he also was visited and was received by Ayatollah Sistani and by all the government officials. To just adapt to what was just said, Iran and Iraq now have some $12 billion of trade every year. As you mentioned, some 45% of Iraq's gas and electricity comes from Iran. And in fact, in their talks, they have decided to increase it to some $20 billion. If I may say, one or two very important factors about this visit, which makes it historical, is that Saddam Hussein, when he attacked Iran, if you remember, in 1975, he had signed an Algiers Accord with the Shah about deciding the borders between Iran and Iraq, which was the Thalweg line in Shatt al-Arab. But on the eve of the attack on Iran after the revolution, he tore that in public in front of the television and said the whole of Shatt al-Arab belongs to Iran. One of the things which has been decided in this visit is that they have confirmed Thalweg lines. So from a political point of view, this is very important. And also from an economic point of view, they have decided to make many moves.
Okay, and Luciano, one of the elephant, as I said in my introduction, is obviously the United States. We know what Donald Trump said when he visited Iraq in that unannounced visit, that secret visit to the U.S. base. He didn't even meet Iraqi officials, and then he said after that visit that U.S. presence in Iraq is necessary to watch Iran. What do you make of the U.S. role here in Iraq and how that will play out going forward between Iraq and Iran as well?
Well, the presence of the United States is much more complicated than the Iranian one, because the presence of the United States is not that well received by most of the Iraqis. That's why the president cannot have a visit of 3 days, visiting all the authorities and visiting places, visiting religious scholars in Najaf. Of course, United States has an absolutely different approach of the relations with Iraq. It's much more securitized. The American administration, as you said, wants only to be in Iraq to contain the expansion of Iranian influence in the region, and it's not the kind of relation that Iran has with Iraq in all the layers of the society and the political system. So basically, I assume that sooner or later the presence of the United States will be required to reach to an end in all the levels, apart from the military cooperation that it will exist for long term, because of course the United States has economic interests there since 2005. The only objective for the United States since now would be only to make sure that their investments are safe and that Iran is not endangering those interests. Something that I don't think Iran is neither interested in put into consideration or in danger.
Farhang, I wonder what point of view is on Trump's statement about watching Iran from Iraq, because Farhang, one of the aspects of the Iraqi government has been that there have been accusations in the past, at least with previous administrations in Iraq, that there have essentially been puppet governments of the United States. Do you agree with that, and what do you make of Trump's statement?
No, as you know, as soon as President Trump made those remarks, all the Iraqi leaders, from different sections and factions strongly opposed it, and they said that America needs Iraqi permission to stay in Iraq, and the function of the Americans in Iraq is not to keep an eye on Iran. No, I don't think. I think this was just something for domestic purposes. America had tens of thousands of forces in Iran, and after 2003, there were many talks of actually wanting to attack Iran. Nothing came of it. So I think at the moment, with just a small number of forces, they really do not have any military function. May I just use this opportunity to say that I think it is in the interest, and has been, in the interest of foreign countries in the 19th century of colonial and imperialist countries, and it has gone on right up to the present time, of divide and rule. If we see that in Europe, countries which fought against each other and killed tens of millions of each other, finally realize that they have to come together and form a union to develop themselves. I believe that countries in the region, Pakistan, which again has a very long history of relationship with Iran, Iraq, Turkey, I think these are the pivotal countries in the area. And the best thing for them to do, and in fact there was a framework for that, which was developed from a long time ago, the Regional Cooperation Council, RCC, if they can develop that and increase their trade, their relationship, their scientific exchanges, this would, of course, both develop the region as well as, of course, prevent foreign intervention. Because terrorist activities has not been good either for Iran or for Iraq or for Pakistan or for any of the Turkey, any of the regional countries. I really believe that it's time for them to learn that their strength lies in unity and not in being separated.
Very well. We're gonna hold on to that thought. In fact, Farhang, we're going to come back, viewers, after this short break. Please do stay with us, Farhang and Luciano. We're going to continue this conversation and add a new voice to it as well. Viewers, a lot more still to come. Stay with us after this break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope, and we'll continue to discuss the Iranian president's recent visit to Iraq. We're still joined by Mr. Farhang Jahanpour and Mr. Luciano Zaccara. We're also going to now join another voice to this discussion. We're now joined by Mr. James M. Dorsey, who's a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. James, thanks for joining us here in Scope. James, what do you make of the trip of President Rouhani to Iraq? How historic is it? And can Iraq practically stand by Iran through these U.S. sanctions, do you think?
It's a very important visit. First of all, of course, the Iran-Iraq relationship is very important. They're neighbors. Iran has great influence in Iraq, has been very economically, as well as militarily and politically, very helpful to Iraq. And of course, it comes in an environment in which much of the international community wants to preserve the Iran nuclear agreement and wants to help Iran to the degree it can, given the nature of the U.S. sanctions, help Iran circumvent those sanctions.
Okay, so Luciano, what do you make of that? Do you think that it's practical? Because, you know, I imagine it's easy to say, Luciano, that Iraq will stand by Iran, but in reality, will it be able to?
As I mentioned before, I think it's very difficult to prevent Iran to continue standing by Iran, because most of the exchanges that happen between Iran and Iraq are happening between the borders, between the provinces, between the people that they make exchange crossing the border. So even though the sanctions are very tough and that they can target third countries, like even any other GCC state, if the United States want to target them.
Let me go to you, Farhang, if I may. Farhang, you know, one of the major obstacles that exists right now is the fact that Iraq has not been able to pay Iran back for many of the energy supplies. That's becoming an issue now, of course, because of the U.S. sanctions and the obstacles that they create. That's a very real-world, practical obstacle, isn't it, Farhang? And do you think that the two countries can work around those sanctions?
First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be with Mr. Dorsey, James Dorsey. I'm a great fan of him. I read his writings quite regularly, and they are extremely well informed. Yes, I think, well, this has been a problem for Iran since the reimposition of sanctions on Iran, illegal reimposition of sanctions, because it's contrary to the Security Council Resolution 2231 and to the agreement reached between Iran and 5+1. But of course, the contacts between Iran and Iraq are so diverse. Millions, literally millions of pilgrims and visitors and tourists are exchanged between the two countries. And also the exchanges that are between them are normally like gas, electricity, goods, agricultural goods. So I think for the time being, for so long as the sanctions continue, they probably can engage in some sort of barter agreement and barter relationship, and they can keep the money till later on. But as you know, the Europeans are now developing a system, a vehicle for making payment to Iran outside the dollar. And I don't see why something similar is not possible between Iraq and Iran.
James, do you agree with that? And you know, James, many would say that Iraq, why would Iraq, side with Iran over the U.S., especially when the U.S. has invested so much money and time, really, in Iraq as well?
I think there are two things. One is, let me say something in advance. Iraq is unique in one other respect.
Okay.
And that is that it is in Iraq that the Saudis, in terms of trying to confront Iran, are using soft power. They're using economic assistance, they're using investment, and therefore they're trying to create an alternative to Iran. And that struggle, if you wish, has yet to play out. And I think that is the field of tension, if you wish, in which the Iraqi government will be maneuvering, because they'll want to balance the two. So that's very significant.
Okay.
I think that the Iraqis have an interest in, obviously keeping the Americans happy, but keep in mind that there's also a lot of criticism and resentment towards the United States in Iraq. The United States is not viewed unanimously as the liberator from Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
So they're very complex attitudes that you're dealing with in terms of both, all three, the United States, attitudes towards Iran, but also attitudes towards Saudi Arabia.
Luciano, if you can hear me now, Luciano, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of the criticism, in the past at least, of too much Iranian influence on Iraq? And I'm sure you've heard of that, of course, because especially in the context of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or Hashd al-Sha'bi as they're called in Arabic, many said that Iran wields too much influence in Iraq. Is there basis to that? Has that now changed, do you think?
Well, it might have changed a little bit. I mean, but it's undeniable the influence that Iran has in Iraq since 2003. But not all this influence can be considered as a negative influence. As it was mentioned by my colleagues, I mean, the influence in the economic development of Iraq, the Iranian influence in the Iraqi economic development has been very important since 2003 until 2005 until now, something that was not covered by the United States. Also, the Iranian participation in the fight against ISIS was fundamental to liberate Mosul and other areas. Again, the United States was not there full time to contribute to the defeat of ISIS, something that Iran did. So all the influence that Iran had or is having since 2005 until now cannot be considered 100% negative, and that's why there are a lot of people that they are more or less satisfied with Iranian presence. This doesn't mean that all the things that are decided in Baghdad are decided in calm, like some people said. But of course, Iran has this leverage like any other regional power that has a lot of influence in the region with a lot of supporters. But we have to bear in mind that al-Sistani in Najaf, which is a very influential figure in Iraqi politics, is not someone that can be considered a puppet or very loyal to Ali Khamenei. Is someone that has its own independence, and in terms of religious legitimacy, can be considered even in a higher level than Ali Khamenei. So I cannot see that the Iraqi religious and political establishment can be mentioned as absolutely puppets of Iran. Of course, we cannot deny the influence. And of course, at the end of the day, if the Iraqi establishment needs to decide for their future, which is the most closest ally that they would decide in order to continue their autonomous or independent position in the region, they would maybe side with Iran rather than the United States.
Farhang, because you're here in Farhang, it makes sense to ask you this question. Going back to, if we may just for a moment, the Iraq-Iran war, Farhang, do you think that both countries have moved beyond the hard feelings, possibly on both sides of the border, but a lot of that on the Iranian side of the border to an extent? Do you think both have moved beyond that? And do you think that going forward, that when we talk about the people-to-people contact, that will be done in a completely positive atmosphere, even those who are not necessarily of the same sect, be they Sunni, Shia, or whoever?
I think this issue of Iranian influence in Iraq has been a bit overdone. It is an insult to the Iraqis. Iraq is not occupied by Iran. Iranian and Iraqis are friends. You are absolutely right that the war was devastating. It was initiated by Saddam Hussein. May I say it here too, by encouragement and prodding of some Western countries. There's no doubt about it. It has been established that he was put to it. And he received huge amounts, tens of billions of dollars from Persian Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, to fight. It killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians, including some with chemical weapons, and altogether nearly 1 million casualties, and destroyed Iran. So what Iran is interested in is to have friendly relations with Iraq. The difference between Iran and some other countries is that Iran has been invited. It walks among friends in Iraq at the moment. Both the Kurdish leaders and Iraqi leaders have actually said it, and it's not an Iranian boast, that had it not been for Iran's timely help, ISIS would have moved close to Baghdad and even to parts of the Kurdish area, to Erbil and so on. So yes, they regard Iran as a friend, as an important friend, as a powerful friend. And I think Iran's interest in Iraq is just to prevent the repetition of hostilities which went on under Saddam Hussein. As James was saying, there's a competition going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think what regional countries can do, Iraq particularly, have been trying, and in Pakistan too, various leaders have been trying to bring these two countries closer. I believe it is in the interest of both Iran and Saudi Arabia and the whole GCC to try to establish closer relations, because this present hostility really will not lead anywhere and will not have a good result for either side.
Okay, James, on that last point, and we just have about a minute left, James, give you the final word. Do you think Iraq is well placed to play the role of mediator in this region? For example, be it Iran, Saudi Arabia, or other such issues that may exist, disagreements that may exist. Is Iraq well placed to play such a role?
I don't think anybody is well placed. First of all, you can lead a horse to the trough. He's got to do the drinking himself. Negotiations are successful when both parties feel that the alternative is too expensive. Certainly the Saudis at this point do not feel that. So with other words, whether or not they were sitting at a table, they have no incentive to truly negotiate. And I don't think that the United States could get them there, and I don't think that Iraq or Pakistan or whatever other country would try it at this point would be able to get them there.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate all guests for their time, their analysis, and insight, of course, as they've spoken of here in this program. Let me thank them from the end there. We're joined by Mr. James M. Dorsey, Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies there in Singapore. We were also joined by Mr. Luciano Zaccara, who is a Research Assistant Professor at Qatar University. And we were joined by Mr. Farhang Jahanpour, who is a Professor at the University of Oxford. We appreciate, of course, all of your time. Viewers, as our guests were talking about, this relationship between Iran and Iraq is a long-standing one. Of course, during the Saddam era, the relationship was not good. especially because of the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqi-imposed war, I should say, as Farhang there correctly pointed out, with the support of many Western countries. But now we're seeing quite a significant shift to the positive between these two countries, especially since the fight of ISIS and Iran's support against ISIS in Iraq itself. We'll wait and see how all of this plays out, because obviously the shadow of the United States remains at this point, and its pressure on Iraq to remove itself from the axis of Iran remains. We'll keep a close eye on that here in The Scope, but I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister says Israel is not a state for all its citizens, but only for Jews. Even the most pro-Israel organizations in the West have criticized Netanyahu for demonizing Arabs. However, with elections coming up in April and corruption investigations hanging over his head, Netanyahu finds himself in a corner. What does the strengthening right wing in Israel mean for its minorities and for peace with Palestinians? To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Abdulaziz Alghashian, who is a researcher at the University of Essex. He's joining us now from Riyadh. And we're also joined by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who is a Palestinian politician, and he is joining us from Ramallah. Abdulaziz and Dr. Barghouti, thank you for joining us here. If I may, Dr. Barghouti, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of Netanyahu's recent statements vis-a-vis Arabs?
Netanyahu's statement has exposed the real policy of the Israeli government and the real nature of the Zionist state. It's a nature of not only extreme nationalism and racism, a system of apartheid where people who are citizens are treated in different ways according to their origin and according to their race. And that is a reflection, the most clear reflection of the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. But more than that, I must say that this Israeli statement and Netanyahu's statement is nothing but actually an indication that the Israeli government and the governing coalition has gone far, far in the direction of becoming a fascist system. Only fascist countries and only fascist regimes would discriminate against their own citizens in this manner. And in a way, this is another form of anti-Semitism that Netanyahu and the Zionist movement is practicing against Palestinians. And it should not be accepted, it should not be tolerated. And but this is the result of the fact that the United States is supporting Israel unequivocally and without any conditions, and is justifying Israeli measures one time after the other.
Abdulaziz, I wonder what you make of Netanyahu's statement. As Dr. Barghouti there said, if we're seeing this in the context of essentially carte blanche support by the U.S. of all Israeli actions, this does seem like Israel can get away with these sorts of statements. The Israeli Prime Minister, no doubt, can get away with saying that basically the Arabs, the 17.5% of Arabs who make up the Israeli population, they don't have the same rights, according to him, as the Jewish population. What do you make of that, Abdulaziz?
Well, it's very, very unfortunate, because I think what this actually shows is that Netanyahu is also, and his coalition is also actually becoming a minority within Israel. That's how unpopular it's actually becoming now with these very anti-Arab sentiments. Now, what's very fascinating, and I think what's very interesting that we have to look at this, is that there has to be, in my opinion, there has to be a nuanced approach to how many Israelis have looked at the Palestinian question and have looked at the Arab question. And I think that, as Dr. Barghouti mentioned, this has been a constant theme within Zionism. But this is an extreme theme within Zionism. Now, what actually perpetuates this extremism towards Arab minorities and probably other minorities is that indeed there is this almost not even amber light, this green light from the Trump administration. That Netanyahu feels very emboldened by Donald Trump to facilitate these nationalistic notions of greater Israel. You know, and one of the aspects here that I think has to be mentioned as well is that you know, the United States is not indispensable. Many times Israeli politicians or prime ministers had to take into account what the United States reaction will be, and then the United States reaction will be towards Israel will be regarding or will be dependent on the Arab states and the Arab League's reactions. At this time, the Arab League's reactions, or the joint stance of the Arab League towards the Israeli issue, or even between themselves, it's not coherent, and they're very. I mean, the Arab League is in disarray now. So what he's doing is that he's actually taken advantage of this disunity in the Arab League to gain more room and to facilitate and to obtain these notions of greater Israel and the nationalistic.
Okay, Abdulaziz, you know, Abdulaziz, we've seen the Israeli Prime Minister already won elections with negative Arab sentiments, you know, asking people to come out to prevent the Arab voters from getting the upper hand. Do you think this is, in fact, I'm going to push you on that point you made earlier, Abdulaziz, because you said it would be, you know, he's a minority within Israel, but sometimes it seems like quite the opposite, doesn't it? It seems like Israeli society is just as a whole moving more right-wing. What do you make of that, Abdulaziz?
This is an interesting point, and I'm very glad you asked me that, because it gives me an opportunity to expand upon this. Now, what I meant by the notion that he is a minority is that this racist rhetoric towards Arabs is many Israelis find that distasteful. Firstly, in this regards, that when you talk about you know, perhaps the society is moving more right-wing. I think there's a trend of nationalism happening all over the world now. Nationalism is just on the rise all over the world. So I think that's what has to be mentioned as well. But in regards to the statements that I made about Netanyahu, I do think that there are many people in Israel that find these racist sentiments to be very distasteful, and they don't want someone, you know, they don't support that narrative. However, what they do support, and this is where Netanyahu is becoming very sly, or I mean, very, very pragmatic here, is that he's trying to correlate this racist rhetoric with the security rhetoric, right? And this is another thing that many Israelis look or agree upon, that if you tie an aspect of race to an aspect of security, then this legitimizes this racist notion, even if they find it distasteful. So what I am trying to say is that the racist rhetoric is potentially the right wing. I mean, if I'm sorry, but potentially a minority. If it wasn't a minority, then he wouldn't try to be seeking an alliance within the. But you know, this is something that I think it's this connection between racism and security.
Okay, just because we're running out of time, I wanted to get a final word, if I may, from Dr. Barghouti. Dr. Barghouti, if you can hear me, I wanted to ask you as well the question I put to Abdulaziz. Do you think all of the Israeli society is moving more right-wing, and that is why we're seeing the Israeli Prime Minister speak in these terms about Arabs, etc.?
Absolutely. I think the whole Israeli society has moved towards not only right-wing racism, but I'm sorry to say, to fascism. And I think Netanyahu is not in the minority. As a matter of fact, there is no big differences between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, and both of them make more than 50% of the seats in the future parliament, plus no less than 25% of other seats who are even more extreme right-wing parties. So the whole Israeli society has moved and shifted to racism and to a system of apartheid. And by the way, Palestinians are not a minority in the land. Actually, they are a minority as Israeli citizens.
Yes.
But Israel is now governing the whole historic Palestine, and the number of Palestinians in the whole historic Palestine is larger than the Jewish Israelis. So practically, it's even worse. It's not just discrimination against minority, but it's a discrimination against the majority of the people who live on this land and who originally owned 90% of the land of this land. So this is the situation, this is racism, this is apartheid, and it should be fought immediately with total and complete boycott of the Israeli government.
All right, we're going to say thank you now to Mr. Abdulaziz Alghashian, researcher at the University of Essex, who is joining us from Riyadh. And we're also going to thank Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, Palestinian politician, who had been joining us from Ramallah. We're going to add another voice to this conversation, viewers. We're now joined by Mr. Gideon Levy, who is a journalist and author, and he's joining us now from Tel Aviv. Gideon, as we appreciate you taking your time out to join us here in the Scope to discuss this issue. Gideon, what do you make of Netanyahu's recent statements about Arabs? This is obviously not necessarily new coming from him, especially considering the last elections as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, Netanyahu is a racist politician, but the problem is that the atmosphere in Israel is so racist, and he knows to use it for his own campaign. And I'm much more troubled by the values of the Israeli society rather than the expressions of the prime minister, because by the end of the day, if racism wouldn't have been so politically correct, if hating the Arabs wouldn't have been so popular, he couldn't make his declarations. So the problem is much deeper than Netanyahu, yes or no. The problem is that the Israeli Jewish society, mainly in the recent years, became Arab-hating, became racist, nationalist, in terms that they've never been before.
Gideon, I wonder what you make of what's been spoken about the divide between Israel, I should say, and American Jews, for example. We've had American Jewish organizations who are traditionally very pro-Israel criticize now Netanyahu on his recent statement. Is that gap growing, do you think?
I think public opinion in the United States is going through a shift. We are just at the beginning, and hopefully this shift will get deeper, because by the end of the day, I'm afraid that the key to a change in the Middle East is still in the United States more than in the region. Now, the Jewish community is part of the public opinion in the States, and they turn very gradually, very slowly, from a blind automatic support in Israel's occupation to a more critical voice. But let's not exaggerate, because we are just in the beginning of this process. And you know, the Israeli propaganda is extremely efficient. And also, I must say, the American Jewish community, and mainly the establishment, is still very, very deeply pro-Zionist. And therefore, we shouldn't have any illusions. By the end of the day, in a moment of crisis, they will always support Israel. But maybe we are facing a beginning of a shift.
And then, Gideon, for a moment, I wanted to go to the argument that, you know, we went through this sort of discussion or two, didn't we, around the world about the nation-state law, for example. And at that time, to the argument from the supporters of such laws was that, listen, we're just boosting Israel's Jewish identity. That doesn't mean that we're going to be discriminating against minorities, be they the 17.5% Arab population who would identify as Israeli Arabs. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's okay for Netanyahu to say such things in the context of the fact that Israel identifies as a Jewish state?
Israel has the right to identify itself as a Jewish state, but it has no right to be declared as a democracy while ignoring equality, ignoring the full rights of the Palestinian Israeli citizens. And above all, look, even both of us, we are talking now only about Israel, the sovereign Israel. But under the rule of Israel, there are another 4.5, 5 million people without any rights, namely in the West Bank and in Gaza. Their voice is even not considered to be listened. So by the end of the day, this law should not be underestimated. It is a legal infrastructure for an apartheid state, not less than this. I don't use this word often, But when you look at the law, you see that it's the first time that Israel declares itself as an apartheid state, declares the privileges of the Jewish majority in the law, which in many ways has also advantages, because now the world can look at Israel in different eyes. Here, Israel declares itself as an apartheid state. There's no other way to see it.
Yeah. So then I'm wondering, Gideon, as a final thought then, what do you make the deal of the century, as Jared Kushner and the Trump administration like to call what they're going to present for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, with a sort of attitude now that we've seen on the part of the Israeli government? Is peace even really possible in such an atmosphere?
Unfortunately not, and I say it with a lot of pain. The chances are no chances, because by the end of the day, don't forget that we went through so many American peace plans, which by the end of the day came to the same conclusions and were never implemented. And the matter of fact is that as long as pressure will not be put on Israel, Israel will not move toward any kind of peace, justice, equal rights, Palestinian state, you name it. And I don't see this pressure coming from Donald Trump. He would be the last president I would expect to really get into it seriously and to really do what is needed. And what is needed is putting pressure on Israel to put an end to the occupation. No American president did so. Why would Donald Trump do so?
Indeed. We'll leave that as a final thought then, Gideon, but of course we appreciate your time out to share your insight and thoughts with us. That was Gideon Levy, journalist and author, speaking there from Tel Aviv via Skype. Now, viewers, as all of our guests, even Abdulaziz and Dr. Barghouti, that said earlier on, this is a reflection of now Israeli society. And the Israeli government is only moving in the direction the society is moving in as well. And that, of course, is a worrying trend. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation there in the occupied territories here in the scope, but I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.